The chill of the pre-dawn air was a familiar thief, stealing the warmth from my threadbare coat and seeping into my bones. It was a cold that felt personal, a constant reminder of the emptiness that had hollowed out my life since Mom died. The sky above was the color of a fading bruise, a muted palette of purple and gray that promised a sun it seemed reluctant to deliver. I clutched the single wilting carnation in my gloved hand, its stem limp and sad. It was all I could afford. Another bill had arrived yesterday, a final notice printed in angry red ink, joining the teetering stack on my kitchen counter, a monument to a battle with cancer that my mother had lost in every conceivable way. We hadn't just lost her. We'd lost everything. The cemetery was my sanctuary and my purgatory, a quiet, manicured place of stone and sorrow where the dead slept more peacefully than the living ever could. I walked the familiar path, my worn boots crunching softly on the gravel, the sound loud and claced, the profound silence. I came here every morning before my 12-hour shift at the hospital, a ritual of grief that felt more necessary than breakfast or sleep. It was here I could speak to her, could unload the burdens of the day before they even began. The fear that coiled in my stomach every time my phone buzzed with an unknown number, the exhaustion that had become a permanent part of my physical being, and the gnawing loneliness that was the worst part of it all. But as I rounded the familiar cypress tree that marked the turn to her plot, I stopped. A figure stood before her grave. A man. He was tall, impossibly so, and broad-shouldered, a silhouette of power carved against the weak morning light. He was dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to drink the shadows around it, tailored with a precision that spoke of a world utterly alien to this humble resting place of nurses and teachers and factory workers. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was a place for mourners, for the quiet and the broken. This man looked like he broke things for a living. He bent slightly from the waist, a gesture of unexpected grace, and placed something on the earth in front of the simple granite headstone. Then he straightened, and for a long moment, simply stood there, his head bowed. I should have turned and left. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat into the shadows, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but my feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a potent mix of fear and an inexplicable curiosity. Who was this man? My mother, Eleanor Vance, had been a hospice nurse. Her life was a quiet tapestry of kindness and compassion, woven from the threads of other people's final moments. She didn't know men who looked like they owned the city, men who moved with the predatory stillness of a panther. As if sensing my presence, he turned his head. Our eyes met across the 30 feet of dew-kissed grass that separated us. I couldn't see the quercus, color of his eyes from this distance, only their intensity. It was a gaze that didn't just see you. It assessed you, cataloged you, and filed you away. There was no surprise in his expression, no alarm. It was as if he had been expecting me. My breath caught in my throat. The carnation in my hand suddenly felt foolish, a pathetic offering compared to what he had left. From my vantage point, I could now see it. A single, perfect red rose, its petals the color of fresh blood against the dark, damp earth. Its velvet perfection was a stark, jarring contrast to my own wilting flower. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that was less a greeting and more an acknowledgement, a dismissal. Then, without another glance, he turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the ground. A moment later, I heard the low, throaty purr of a powerful engine and saw the sleek, black shape of a car that cost more than my apartment building glide silently away down the narrow cemetery road. I stood, frozen for a full minute, the cold forgotten, my mind racing. I finally forced my legs to move, approaching the grave with a sense of trepidation, as if I were stepping onto holy or desecrated ground. There it was. The rose lay beside the simple inscription, Eleanor Vance, beloved mother, she healed with her hands and her heart. The flower was flawless, not a single blemish on its velvety petals, a dewdrop clinging to its edge like a tiny diamond. It was an offering of impossible luxury, a gesture of profound meaning from a man I had never seen before. The next morning, I came earlier, driven by a nervous energy. He was already there. The same dark suit, the same imposing stillness. He placed another rose, turned, saw me, nodded, and left. And the morning after that, and the one after that. Each day, a new perfect rose joined the one from the day before. The base of my mother's headstone was beginning to look like a morbidly beautiful garden. My fear began to curdle into a strange, obsessive curiosity. I started noticing details. The impossibly expensive watch that glinted on his wrist, the subtle, perfect cut of his dark hair, the way he never seemed to feel the cold, standing stoically in his suit while I shivered in my layers. He never spoke. He never approached. He just performed his ritual and left, a silent, intimidating specter in my private place of grief. His presence was an enigma, a question mark branded onto the most painful part of my life. Who was he to my mother? An old friend? A secret lover? The idea was absurd. My mother's life had been an open book, and its pages were filled with long shifts, lukewarm tea, and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. There were no chapters involving mysterious, wealthy men in black cars. The mystery of the man at the cemetery was soon eclipsed by the more immediate terror of my actual life. Marco, my ex, had been a mistake of epic proportions, a charming parasite I'd thankfully shed 6 months ago. But his gambling debts, some of which he'd cleverly convinced me to co-sign for, during a moment of weakness, lingered like a chronic disease. His texts had become more frequent, more demanding. Last night, he'd escalated from messages to showing up at my door, his face slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a desperation that made him dangerous. "Come on, Alara," he'd wheezed, blocking my doorway. "Just 500. The guy is gonna break my legs." "I don't have it, Marco," I'd said, my voice trembling as I tried to push the door closed. "I have nothing." He'd shoved it back open, his charm curdled into ugly menace. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. "Don't lie to me. You work. Nurses make good money." He didn't understand that every cent I made was vaporized by rent and the black hole of my mother's medical bills. I'd wrenched my arm away, the sudden movement causing him to stumble. I'd used the opportunity to slam the door and throw the deadbolt, my back pressed against the wood, listening to him curse and bang on the door before finally shuffling away. Now, in the gray light of dawn, a dark purple bruise was blooming on my bicep, a visceral reminder of my vulnerability. I pulled my sleeve down, my hands shaking. I felt fragile, on the verge of shattering. As I approached my mother's grave, I saw him, the man. He was standing in his usual spot, but today, something was different. He didn't turn to leave as I drew near. He waited. My steps faltered. I stopped a few feet away, my heart doing a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. He turned his head slowly, and this time I was close enough to see his eyes. They were the color of dark, aged whiskey, flecked with gold, and they were fixed on me with an unnerving focus. "Alara," he said. My name on his lips was a shock, a violation. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and deep, but with an edge of gravel, like silk being dragged over stone. It was a voice accustomed to command, a voice that didn't ask, but stated. "How do you know my name?" I whispered, my voice thin and reedy. His gaze dropped from my face to my arm, the one Marco had grabbed. It was as if he had X-ray vision, as if he could see the ugly bruise hidden beneath the fabric of my coat. A muscle in his jaw clenched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that radiated controlled violence. "He will not touch you again." It wasn't a question or a comfort. It was a decree, a sentence passed by a judge who was also the executioner. The finality in his tone terrified me more than Marco's desperate rage. He seemed to know everything: my name, my fear, the mark on my skin. This stranger, this ghost from a world I didn't know, had just inserted himself into the wreckage of my life with the force of a wrecking ball. "Who are you?" I demanded, a surge of adrenaline momentarily overriding my fear. "Why are you here? What do you want?" He held my gaze for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold control. "My name is Dante Moretti," he said, as if that should explain everything, and perhaps in some circles, it did. The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it, the weight, the authority told me it should. He gave another one of his infinitesimal nods, the one that served as a full stop to any conversation he deemed over. Then he turned and walked to his car, leaving me alone with his words hanging in the frigid air, a promise that felt more like a threat. I stood there shivering, no longer from the cold, but from the chilling certainty that my life, already spiraling out of control, had just been hijacked. The rest of the day was a blur of beeping machines, demanding patience, and the sterile smell of antiseptic. I moved on autopilot, my mind miles away, replaying the pre-dawn encounter. "Dante Moretti, he will not touch you again." The words echoed, a strange mix of terror and, to my shame, a sliver of relief. The idea of someone powerful, enough to simply decree my safety, was a seductive fantasy, but the reality was terrifying. Power like that came at a price, and I had nothing left to pay with. By the time my shift ended, exhaustion had ground my anxiety down to a dull, throbbing ache. All I wanted was to get back to my tiny apartment, lock the door, and pretend the world didn't exist. As I pushed through the hospital's revolving doors, the evening air hit me, thick with the smell of city grit and exhaust fumes. I started my usual walk to the bus stop, my head down, my thoughts churning. That's when I saw them, 3 of them, identical black SUVs. Their tinted windows, like the eyes of enormous insects, were parked along the curb, engines idling with a low, menacing rumble. They weren't just parked, they were positioned, forming a silent, intimidating blockade. Pedestrians gave them a wide berth, sensing the palpable aura of untouchable power that surrounded them. My blood ran cold. This wasn't police. This wasn't government. This was something else entirely. Before I could turn and flee back into the relative safety of the hospital, the passenger door of the lead vehicle opened. A man in a suit as sharp as his boss's stepped out. He was younger than Dante, his face a stoic, professional mask, but he moved with the same coiled efficiency. He looked directly at me, his eyes missing nothing. "Alara Vance?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. I froze, my feet glued to the pavement. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. "I'm Julian," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Mr. Moretti sent me. You are to come with us." It was a command cloaked in the thinnest veil of civility. The phrase, "you are to come with us," echoed the chilling finality of Dante's earlier statement. There was no room for refusal. Passers-by were starting to stare, their curiosity piqued by the cinematic display of quiet force. I felt a hot flush of humiliation and fear. Running would be pointless. Screaming would only cause a scene that these men were clearly equipped to handle with brutal discretion. I had no choice. The realization landed with the heavy thud of a prison door slamming shut. With a trembling hand, I clutched the strap of my worn shoulder bag. Julian held the back door of the SUV open, an impassive valet to my own abduction. The interior was a cavern of black leather and polished wood, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic and clean. It was like stepping into another dimension. I slid onto the plush seat, and Julian closed the door with a solid, definitive thump that sealed me inside. He got back in the front, and in perfect, silent synchronicity, the three vehicles pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, leaving my old life behind on a dirty city sidewalk. The journey was silent. Julian didn't speak, and the driver, a thick-necked man whose eyes I could see in the rear-view mirror, never took them off the road. We drove out of the city, the landscape shifting from concrete and neon to the dark, winding roads of the wealthy suburbs. Towering trees replaced skyscrapers, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead, swallowing the last of the daylight. My mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible. Dante Moretti, the roses. My mother, Marco. It was a chaotic jumble of facts that refused to form a coherent picture. Was I being saved or kidnapped? The line between the two had become terrifyingly blurred. After what felt like an eternity, we turned onto a private road marked by an imposing set of wrought iron gates. They swung open without a sound, as if by magic, and we proceeded up a long, winding driveway flanked by perfectly manicured lawns. And then I saw the house. It wasn't a house, it was a monument. A sprawling structure of glass and dark stone. It clung to the side of a hill, overlooking a valley of twinkling city lights. It was brutally modern, all clean lines and sharp angles. A fortress of wealth that seemed both beautiful and forbidding. The SUV purred to a stop under a covered portico. Julian was out and had my door open before I could even process where I was. "This way, please," he said, gesturing towards a massive front door made of dark, heavy wood. I stepped out of the car on unsteady legs, feeling like a common sparrow that had accidentally flown into an eagle's eyrie. The air here was different, clean, crisp, and filled with the scent of pine and money. The inside was even more breathtaking. The foyer had a ceiling that soared 2 stories high, and a massive abstract painting that was probably worth more than I would earn in a lifetime hung on one wall. The floors were polished marble, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft click of my own cheap shoes. An older woman with her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, was waiting for us. "This is Sophia," Julian said. "She will show you to your room. Make yourself comfortable. Mr. Moretti will join you shortly." Sophia gave me a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes and beckoned for me to follow. She led me up a floating staircase with glass railings to the 2nd floor and down a long, wide hallway. She stopped at a pair of double doors and pushed them open. "Your suite," she announced, her voice devoid of emotion. It wasn't a room. It was bigger than my entire apartment. A massive bed with a mountain of pillows sat in the center. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a panoramic view of the distant city. A sitting area with a white sofa and sleek armchairs was arranged around a low, glass table. Sophia walked over to another door. "The bathroom is through here," she said, "and the closet. There are clothes for you. Dinner will be brought up in an hour, unless you would prefer to join Mr. Moretti downstairs." I stared at her, dumbfounded. Clothes for me? I walked numbly towards the closet door and opened it. It was a walk-in, of course, and it was filled. Racks of dresses, sweaters, trousers, and blouses, all in muted, elegant colors. A row of shoes, from sneakers to heels, was arranged on shelves. Everything looked soft, expensive, and, as I reached out to touch the sleeve of a cashmere sweater, impossibly my size. A cold dread snaked its way up my spine. This wasn't a spontaneous rescue. This was planned, calculated. How long had he been watching me? How much did he know? I think I'll just stay here," I managed to stammer. "Very good," Sophia said with a crisp nod. "If you need anything, there is an intercom on the wall." She turned and left, closing the doors softly behind her, leaving me alone in the opulent, silent cage. I stood in the middle of the vast room, still in my worn nursing scrubs, a piece of driftwood washed up on a shore of unimaginable luxury. I felt the stark contrast in every fiber of my being. The coarse, cheap fabric of my uniform against the backdrop of silk and cashmere. The scuffs on my practical shoes on a rug that was probably hand-woven in some far-off land. I was an anomaly, a glitch in this perfect, sterile world. I walked over to the immense window and stared out at the city lights. It looked like a handful of scattered diamonds on black velvet. From up here, the grit, the noise, the desperation of my world was invisible, reduced to a pretty, distant sparkle. It was a God's eye view, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the soul, that I was now in the domain of the God who ruled it. I was examining a silk blouse, the fabric cool and impossibly smooth against my fingertips, when the doors to the suite opened without a knock. Dante Moretti stood there, filling the doorway. He had changed out of his suit and was now wearing dark trousers and a simple, dark gray Henley that stretched across his broad chest, revealing the powerful musculature beneath. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like what he was, a predator in his own territory. He closed the doors behind him, the sound echoing the finality of the car door earlier. His eyes swept the room, taking in my small, tense form before landing on the closet. "I hope they are to your liking," he said, his voice that same low, controlled rumble. "I had to guess at your taste." "You had to guess my size," I corrected, my voice sharper than I intended. "How did you know my size? How long have you been watching me?" He walked further into the room, his movements fluid and economical. He stopped near the seating area, keeping a respectable distance, yet his presence dominated the space, shrinking it around me. "I have known your size for some time. I have been aware of you, Alara, for a while." "Aware of me? Or spying on me?" The accusation hung in the air between us. A flicker of something annoyance, regret, crossed his features before being suppressed. "There is a fine line between the two," he admitted. "One I have had to cross for your own protection." "My protection?" I laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You have your men abduct me from the street and lock me in this museum, and you call it protection? Did they harm you?" he asked, his tone dangerously soft. "No, but were you treated with anything other than respect?" "That's not the point," I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "The point is, I'm a prisoner here. You can put a bow on it and call it a suite, But it's a cage. A cage is meant to keep something in, he said, his whiskey-colored eyes boring into me. This house is meant to keep the world out. There is a difference. He paused, letting his words sink in. Your mother's medical debt has been settled. All of it. The collection agencies will no longer be calling. I stared at him, my anger deflating, replaced by a wave of stunned disbelief. The debt was a mountain, an insurmountable peak that had cast a shadow over my entire existence. The thought of it, simply gone, was incomprehensible. How? I whispered. That's impossible. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money is a tool, Alara. I simply have more of it than most, he said with a dismissive shrug, as if discussing the weather. As for your former boyfriend, Marco, he has also been handled. He has taken a permanent vacation. He will not trouble you again. The cold, clinical way he said handled sent a shiver down my spine. I thought of Marco's panicked face, his desperation. I didn't like him. I even hated him a little, but the idea of what a man like Dante Moretti might do to him made me feel sick. What did you do to him? I did what was necessary to ensure your safety, he stated, his expression unyielding. He is unharmed, but he understands the consequences of ever returning to this city or attempting to contact you again. He had just solved the two most crushing, terrifying problems in my life with a casual wave of his hand. He had erased my debt and removed my tormentor. It should have been the answer to every prayer I'd whispered in the dark. Instead, it felt like I had just been bound to him with chains of gratitude, each one heavier than the last. There was no such thing as a free lunch, and the feast he was laying before me would surely cost me my soul. Why? I finally asked, the question that had been screaming in my mind since I first saw him at the cemetery. Why are you doing any of this? I don't know you. What do you want from me? He moved then, closing the distance between us in two silent strides. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I had to tilt my head back to look up at him. His scent filled my senses clean, masculine, with a hint of expensive soap and something uniquely him, something dark and dangerous. What I want, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur, is to keep you safe. I am offering you a life without fear, Alara. A life where you don't have to look over your shoulder, where the bills are always paid, where you are protected from the filth of the world. And the catch? I breathed, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs. His gaze was a physical touch, intense and possessive. The catch is that your protection comes from me. You will live here, in my house. You will not want for anything. You will be safe. But you will be mine to protect. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from my cheek. His touch was surprisingly soft, a stark contrast to the raw power he exuded. That is the offer. That is the condition. It was a declaration of ownership disguised as an offer of sanctuary. He was buying me, not with money, but with safety. He was caging me, not with bars, but with luxury and the removal of all my earthly fears. The most terrifying part was the small, treacherous part of me that was tempted. The part that was so tired of fighting, so weary of being scared. The part that looked at this powerful, dangerous man and saw not a monster, but a fortress. You still haven't answered my question, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Why me? Why my mother? Why the roses? He let out a long, slow breath, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his armor of control. A shadow of an old, deep pain flickered in his eyes. He stepped back, putting distance between us again, as if the proximity made the topic too difficult. He walked over to the window and stared out at the city lights, his back to me. "My mother died when I was 16, he began, his voice flat, stripped of its usual commanding tone. "She was ill for a very long time. My father, he was a man who didn't deal well with weakness. He was busy with his business, and my mother became an inconvenience to him. We had money, private nurses, the best doctors, but they were all cold, clinical. They treated her like a disease, not a person." He fell silent for a moment, lost in a memory, couldn't see. "Towards the end, she was moved to a hospice. That's where she met your mother. Eleanor was her nurse for the last 2 months of her life." He turned his head, looking at me over his shoulder. "Your mother was different. She wasn't just doing a job. She cared. She would sit and talk to my mother for hours, even when her shift was over. She'd brush her hair, read to her, hold her hand when she was scared. She treated my mother with a dignity and a kindness that her own family had failed to provide." The story was so at odds with the man telling it. I tried to picture a 16-year-old Dante watching this unfold, a boy learning about compassion from a stranger while his own family fell short. "I visited every day after school," he continued, his voice softer now. "I would sit in the corner and watch. I never forgot what your mother did, the grace she showed. After my mother died, my father tried to give Eleanor money, a big check to thank her. She refused it. She said, 'Your wife's friendship was my payment.' That was the kind of woman she was." He turned fully to face me again, his eyes dark with the weight of the past. "I never forgot her. I kept track of her over the years, from a distance. I made sure she was okay, quietly. When I found out she was sick, I was making arrangements to take care of everything, to move her to the best private facility. But I was too late. The cancer was too aggressive. She was gone before I could repay the debt." My breath hitched. The pieces were finally clicking into place. It wasn't about me, not really. It was about her. "The roses?" I whispered. "My mother loved red roses," he said simply. It felt right, a small gesture to honor the woman who was kind to my mother at the end. "When I saw you there, at her grave, so much like her, with the same quiet strength, the same sadness in your eyes, and I knew about your troubles. I knew the debt was not yet paid. It has been passed to you. Protecting you is how I honor your mother. It's how I repay the kindness she showed mine." The confession laid him bare, revealing a core of old pain and a fierce, almost fanatical sense of loyalty. His possessiveness, his high-handed actions, they weren't random acts of a powerful tyrant. They were the fulfillment of a decades-old promise made by a grieving boy. It was twisted, certainly. It was controlling, absolutely. But it was also rooted in something I could almost understand, a debt of honor. He wasn't just protecting me from my problems. He was protecting his memory of the one good thing he witnessed in the darkest time of his life. And in his mind, I had become the living embodiment of that memory. The days that followed blurred into a surreal routine. I lived in a state of luxurious suspension, a ghost haunting the hallways of Dante's minimalist fortress. Sophia attended to my needs with silent efficiency, bringing trays of exquisite food I barely touched and tidying rooms that were never messy. I wore the clothes from the closet, soft fabrics that felt alien against my skin, a constant reminder of my gilded captivity. I read books from the vast library, swam in the indoor pool that looked out over the valley, and tried not to think about the fact that I couldn't leave. The gates remained closed. Dante was a constant, brooding presence. He worked from a large office on the ground floor, its glass walls revealing him bent over paperwork or speaking in low, urgent tones on the phone. We ate dinner together most nights, at a massive dining table that could have seated 20. The meals were silent, tense affairs. The space between us crackled with unspoken questions and a simmering awareness that was both thrilling and terrifying. I was acutely aware of him, the way he moved, the deep timbre of his voice, the intensity of his gaze when he thought I wasn't looking. He was handsome in a way that was almost brutal, his features sharp and defined, as if carved from granite. Predators are often beautiful. It's how they lure you in. One evening, the fragile peace of our strange cohabitation was shattered. We were in the middle of another silent dinner when his phone, a sleek black burner that was never far from his hand, buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor changed. The mask of calm control dissolved, replaced by a chilling stillness that was more terrifying than any overt display of anger. "Scusa," he murmured, his voice tight. He pushed his chair back and walked out onto the adjoining terrace, closing the glass door behind him. I watched his silhouette as he paced, his movements sharp and agitated. I couldn't hear his words, but the language of his body was universal: rage, cold, controlled, and lethal. He was gone for 10 minutes. When he came back inside, his face was a pale, tight mask of fury. He sat back down, but he didn't pick up his fork. He just stared at his plate, his jaw working. "Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He lifted his eyes to mine, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. It was a look of pure, predatory violence. "No," he said, his voice flat. "Everything is not all right." He took a deep breath, visibly reining in his temper. "There are competitors in my line of business, families who do not appreciate my methods or my success. They are vultures, always circling, looking for weakness. And," I prompted, my heart starting to pound. His gaze was so intense I felt it could burn my skin. "And they have identified a new, potential weakness." He let the words hang in the air. "You." The bite of salmon I had just taken turned to ash in my mouth. "Me? How?" "No one knows I'm here. They are not stupid," he bit out. "They've had people watching me for months. They saw me at the cemetery. They've been to your old apartment building, asking questions. The super told them you'd left in a hurry with some well-dressed men. They are putting the pieces together. The Falcone family, in particular. They are sniffing around, trying to figure out who you are to me. And in our world, a woman connected to a man like me is one of two things: a target or a trap. The reality of his world, a world I had only seen in movies, crashed down on me with suffocating force. It was no longer an abstract concept. It had a name, the Falcons, and it had a face, mine. The safety he had promised, the fortress he had built, now felt like a bullseye. "So what does this mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It means," he said, leaning forward, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "that my initial assessment was correct. You are not safe out there. The cage you despise so much, it just became your only sanctuary. From this moment on, the security protocols will be doubled. No one comes in or out of this property without my direct authorization. You do not leave this house, not for any reason. Do you understand me, Alara?" I could only nod, my throat tight with fear. The gilded cage had transformed. The bars, once invisible, were now cold, hard steel. Dante's protection was no longer just about shielding me from the ghosts of my past. It was now about shielding me from the demons of his present. He had pulled me from the frying pan of my own desperate life, only to drop me squarely into the fire of his, and he was the only one who could keep me from being burned alive. The justification for my confinement was now absolute, cemented by a tangible external threat. My life was no longer my own in any sense of the word. It belonged to him, because he was the only one capable of preserving it. The tension in the house became a palpable entity, a low hum of anxiety that vibrated in the very walls. The number of dark-suited men patrolling the grounds seemed to double overnight. They were silent and watchful, their presence a constant reminder of the unseen enemy beyond the gates. Julian was a near-constant fixture at Dante's crater. Side, the two of them often huddled in the office, their voices low and intense as they spoke in a rapid mix of English and Italian. Dante's focus was absolute. He was a general preparing for war. He explained to me, in clipped, dispassionate terms, that a direct move against a rival family was a delicate matter, governed by unwritten rules and a brutal calculus of risk and reward. The Falcons were testing him, probing for a soft spot. My existence was that soft spot. "They think you are my lover," he'd stated one night, not looking at me. "They think love makes a man weak, sentimental. They are mistaken. It makes him ruthless." The statement hung in the air, a tacit admission of something I hadn't dared to label. He hadn't touched me since that first night, hadn't breached the physical distance between us. Yet his possessiveness was a tangible force, a brand on my soul. He saw me as his, and the Falcon's interest in me was not just a threat to my safety, but an unforgivable trespass on his territory. In a strange way, the external threat solidified my place in the house. I was no longer just a project, a debt to be repaid. I was a strategic asset, a person whose safety was intrinsically linked to his own power and reputation. This new reality was terrifying, but it also gave me a bizarre sense of purpose. My role was to stay safe, to be the one part of his life that was secure while he waged war outside the walls. One afternoon, he called me into his office. He was standing before the glass wall, looking out at the grounds. He didn't turn when I entered. "I wanted to give you an update," he said, his voice calm, almost serene. "Regarding Marco," I stiffened. I had almost managed to push the thought of my feckless ex-boyfriend from my mind. "You said you handled it." "I did," he confirmed. "But I believe in transparency, at least with you." He finally turned to face me. "Julian paid him a visit the day you came here. There was no violence. It wasn't necessary. Men like Marco are governed by fear and self-interest. Julian simply provided him with a clearer understanding of both." He walked over to his desk and picked up a thin file, opening it. "We explained that his association with you was now problematic. We presented him with a ledger of the money he had borrowed, gambled away, and extorted from you. We also presented him with evidence of several other small-time scams he was running, enough to put him away for a few years if we were to pass it along to the authorities." My stomach churned. Of course, they knew everything. "We offered him a choice," Dante continued, his tone that of a CEO discussing a business transaction. He could face the consequences of his actions, both legal and otherwise. Or he could accept a relocation package. He slid a photograph across the desk towards me. It was a picture of a bus ticket, a one-way ticket to a desolate-sounding town in Alaska. "We returned the money he took from you, gave him enough cash to start a new, miserable life, and put him on that bus." Julian's men watched him get on it, He understands that my organization has a very long reach. Should he ever decide to travel south of the Canadian border again, his life expectancy will decrease dramatically. I stared at the photograph of the bus ticket. It was so mundane, so bureaucratic. Yet it was a death sentence of a kind, a sentence to a life of exile and obscurity. Dante hadn't beaten him or killed him. He had erased him. He had solved my problem with the chilling efficiency of a surgeon excising a tumor. There was no mess, no drama, just a quiet, permanent removal. It was a terrifying demonstration of his power, the ability to not just defeat an enemy, but to unmake their entire existence. The personal threat was gone, utterly and completely neutralized. With the Marco situation relegated to a closed file, Dante's entire focus shifted to the Falcones. The house became a command center. Men I'd never seen before, men with hard faces and harder eyes, came and went at odd hours. The nights grew longer for Dante. He would often disappear after dinner, only to return in the pre-dawn hours, his face etched with exhaustion and a grim sort of satisfaction. He never spoke of where he went or what he did, and I never asked. I didn't want to know. I would see him from my window, striding across the lawn with Julian, the sky behind them bruised with the first light of day. He would return smelling of the cold night air, of gasoline, and sometimes, faintly, of smoke. The war, or whatever it was fought in the shadows, far from my gilded cage. I was a spectator to the preparations, a witness to the aftermath etched on the face of the man who had made himself my protector. One night, he came back later than usual. I had been unable to sleep, curled up in an armchair in my suite, watching the distant city lights. I heard the faint crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, and then, a few minutes later, the soft click of the front door. I don't know what compelled me, but I crept out of my room and down the floating staircase. The lower level was dark, save for a single lamp glowing in his office. He was there, standing in the middle of the room, his back to me. He was shrugging off his suit jacket. As he turned to place it on his chair, I saw the gash. A clean, sharp cut high on his cheekbone, a line of angry red against his pale, tired skin. Dried blood was crusted at the edge of it. My breath caught in my throat. It was the first physical evidence of the violence I knew was happening, proof that his world could touch him, could wound him. He saw me then, standing in the doorway, my hand pressed to my mouth. His expression didn't change, but his eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. "It is nothing," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Let me help," I heard myself say, the nurse in me overriding the fear. I walked into the room, my bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. I went to the small bar in the corner, found a bottle of his expensive whiskey and a clean cloth napkin. I poured a small amount of the alcohol onto the cloth and approached him cautiously, as one would approach a wounded animal. He stood perfectly still as I reached up and gently dabbed at the cut. He was so much taller than me, I had to stand on my toes. He flinched slightly as the alcohol stung the wound, a sharp intake of breath the only sign of his pain. His skin was warm beneath my fingers. I could feel the rough stubble of his jaw, see the tiny lines of exhaustion around his eyes. In this moment, stripped of his power and authority, he was just a man, a tired, wounded man. "It is finished," he said, his voice a low murmur that vibrated through my hand. "The Falcons have agreed to a new arrangement. They will no longer be a problem for us." The finality of his words was absolute. The external threat, like the personal one, had been resolved. He had gone out into the dark, violent world, and slain the dragons that threatened his fortress, that threatened me. He had done it all to protect me, to fulfill a promise to my mother, to satisfy his own code of honor. I finished cleaning the cut, my movements slow and gentle. His eyes never left my face. His big, warm hands came up to rest on my waist, not to pull me closer, but simply to steady himself, or perhaps to steady me. The space between us was electric, charged with all the things we hadn't said, all the tension that had been building for weeks. The war was over. The threats were gone. And now, in the quiet aftermath, there was nothing left but the two of us. With the external and internal threats neutralized, the oppressive tension that had suffocated the house for weeks finally dissipated, leaving a strange, quiet vacuum in its wake. The extra guards vanished as silently as they had appeared. The house returned to its state of monastic calm, but the silence that remained was different. It was no longer fraught with anxiety, but thick with a heavy, expectant stillness. The danger was gone, and with it, the primary justification for our strange arrangement. We were left with only the truth of our situation, a powerful, lonely man and the woman he had claimed, bound together by a debt to a ghost. That night, after I had tended to the cut on his cheek, he didn't retreat behind his usual walls of control. The mask was down. The weariness he carried was not just physical. It was a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He sank into one of the leather armchairs in his office. The glass of whiskey I'd poured for him held loosely in his hand. He stared into the amber liquid as if searching for an answer. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure of my place. My role as the protected asset was over. What was I now? I started to back away, to give him the solitude he seemed to crave. "Don't go," he said, his voice quiet, but firm, stopping me in my tracks. He looked up at me, his whiskey-colored eyes vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. "Please." The word please was so alien coming from him that it was more compelling than any command. I walked back into the room and perched on the edge of the chair opposite him. The silence stretched, but it was comfortable, companionable. "This life," he began, swirling the whiskey in his glass, "it costs you. People see the money, the power. They don't see the price, the constant vigilance, the betrayals, the loneliness." He took a sip of the drink. "You can't trust anyone. Not really. Loyalty is bought, and fear is a currency that devalues over time." He looked at me then, a direct, searching gaze. "Protecting you, this has felt different. It hasn't been a transaction. It felt," he struggled for the word, "clean, necessary. Like the first truly meaningful thing I have done since I took my father's chair." His confession was a crack in the granite, a glimpse into the heart of the man beneath the monster. He saw his protection of me not as an exercise of power, but as an act of redemption. It was his penance and his purpose, all wrapped up in the legacy of my mother's kindness. "My mother," I said softly. "You're doing it for her." "I started to," he admitted, his gaze dropping to my hands, which were clenched in my lap. "But it is no longer just about her. It is about you." He set his glass down on the table with a soft click and leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. "I have watched you, Alara. I have seen your strength, your quiet resilience. You face the world with a courage you don't even recognize in yourself. You are like her, yes, but you are also you." He rose from his chair and came to kneel before me, a gesture of supplication so shocking it stole the breath from my lungs. He took my hands in his large, calloused palms enveloping my smaller, softer ones. His touch was warm and steady. "I have brought violence and fear to your doorstep," he murmured, his thumbs stroking the backs of my hands. I have caged you and controlled you. I have justified it as protection, as honor, but it has also been selfish. I wanted to keep you, to have one thing in my life that was not tainted by the blood and the lies. His raw honesty was disarming. He was laying his sins, his motivations, his very soul at my feet. The power dynamic between us had momentarily inverted. In this quiet moment of confession, he was the vulnerable one. He lifted a hand to my face, his fingers gently tracing the line of my jaw. His touch was hesitant, questioning. All the fear I'd had of him, all the resentment for my captivity, melted away in the face of this broken, honest man. I saw not the mafia boss, the ruthless enforcer, but the grieving boy who had never forgotten a single act of kindness. The simmering tension that had been a constant undercurrent between us finally reached its breaking point. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I was caught in the magnetic pull of his gravity, my own loneliness and fear finding a strange and dangerous solace in his. When his lips met mine, it wasn't gentle. It was a kiss of desperation and possession, a raw, hungry claiming. It was the culmination of weeks of watching, of wanting, of circling. It spoke of loneliness and grief, of violence and protection. It was the taste of whiskey and sorrow, and a deep aching need. I opened to him, my hands coming up to tangle in his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer. It wasn't a surrender, it was a mutual recognition. We were two broken, lonely people who had found each other in the shadow of a grave, and in this kiss, we were forging a new, terrifying, and exhilarating reality. It was a kiss that sealed a bargain far more intimate than the one he had first proposed. It was a promise and a warning, the beginning of something beautiful and deadly. The next morning, the house felt different. The air was lighter, the shadows less menacing. The kiss had changed everything. It had shattered the formal barrier between captor and captive, replacing it with a fragile, electrifying intimacy. I woke up in the massive bed, the sheets smelling faintly of his scent, a ghost of his presence from the night before. He had walked me back to my room, his hand a warm, steady pressure on the small of my back, and left me at the door with a lingering look that promised more than words ever could. I found him on the terrace, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the sun burn the morning mist off the valley below. He was dressed in his usual casual but expensive attire, but he seemed more relaxed. The rigid control he normally held over himself loosened. He turned as I approached, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips. It transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, almost approachable. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "Good morning," I replied. My own voice? A little shy. I leaned against the railing beside him, the cool stone, a grounding presence. We stood in silence for a few moments, watching the world wake up below us. "The threats are gone, Alara," he said finally, turning to face me. His expression was serious, his smile gone. "Marco is a ghost. The falcons have been pacified. The debt is paid, both yours and mine. There is no longer any reason for you to be here." My heart plummeted. I had known this was coming. The justification for my presence had been systematically eliminated. I was free. The thought should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like a cliff edge crumbling beneath my feet. "Julian has arranged for a new apartment for you," he continued, his tone businesslike, as if he were closing a deal. "Downtown, with a year's rent paid in advance. There is also a bank account in your name. It contains enough money for you to start over, anywhere you want, to go back to school, to travel, to never work another day in your life if you so choose. You are free to go. The car is waiting whenever you are ready. He was giving me everything he'd promised, a life without fear or want. He was giving me back my agency, my freedom. It was a genuine offer, delivered with a detached fairness that felt like a knife twisting in my gut. After the intimacy of last night, the raw connection we had shared, this felt like a dismissal, a severance package. I stared at him, my mind reeling. I thought of my old life, the constant, grinding anxiety, the loneliness that was a physical ache in my chest, the fear. He had taken it all away, but what would I be returning to? An empty apartment, a life devoid of the very things I had grown accustomed to. The danger, yes, but also the fierce protection, the quiet companionship, the intensity of the man standing before me. To leave him now would be to leave a part of myself behind. "This is what you want?" I asked, my voice small. "What I want is irrelevant," he said, his jaw tight. "I took your choice away from you when I brought you here. I am giving it back. This is the only honorable thing to do." Honor. It always came back to his rigid, uncompromising code. He had repaid his debt, and now his code demanded he release me. He was setting me free, even if it cost him the one clean thing in his life. I turned and walked back into the house, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. I walked through the living room, past the library, towards the massive front door. My heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat of indecision. I could walk out that door and never look back. I could be free, safe, and rich beyond my wildest dreams. I could have a normal life. But what was a normal life? Was it a life without passion, without the terrifying thrill of being truly, fiercely protected? Was it a life without him? My hand was on the heavy wood of the front door. I could feel the cool, smooth grain beneath my palm. Freedom was just on the other side. Quiet, safe, lonely freedom. I took a deep breath and pictured it. Waking up alone, eating alone, facing the quiet evenings alone. It was the life I was used to, but after my time here, it seemed unbearable. I let my hand fall from the door. I turned around. Dante was standing in the archway to the terrace, watching me, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes were full of a desperate, pleading hope. He was testing me, and perhaps himself. I walked back towards him, my steps sure and steady. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of him, so close our bodies were almost touching. I looked up into his dark, intense eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice clear and strong. The relief that washed over his face was so profound, it was like watching a dam break. The control, the rigidity, the cold authority, it all crumbled, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. He reached for me, his hands framing my face, as he lowered his head and kissed me again. This time, it wasn't the desperate, claiming kiss of the night before. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared victory. It was gentle and deep, a promise of a new beginning. My choice. I had been given a way out, and I had chosen the cage. I had chosen him. My decision to stay shifted the very foundation of our relationship. It was no longer a matter of protection or obligation. It was a conscious, willing partnership. The unspoken question of my future had been answered, and the house itself seemed to exhale. Dante's relief was palpable, a quiet joy that softened the hard edges of his personality. He was more present, more open. He would seek me out during the day, not for any particular reason, but just to be in the same room, as if my presence was a balm to his turbulent soul. A few days later, he led me into his office, a place I still associated with war councils and tense phone calls. But today, the atmosphere was calm. He walked behind his massive desk, but instead of sitting, he ran his hand over a discreet panel in the dark wood wall behind it. A section of the wall slid back with a whisper-quiet hiss, revealing a large, formidable safe. He spun the combination dial with practiced ease, the tumblers clicking softly into place, and pulled the heavy steel door open. My mind reflexively braced for something sinister: wads of cash, weapons, incriminating documents. Instead, he reached inside and pulled out a small dark blue velvet box, worn and faded at the corners. It looked ancient. He closed the safe and came around the desk, stopping in front of me. He held the box in his palm for a moment, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "When my mother knew she was dying," he began, his voice low, "she gave this to me. She told me to give it to the woman I chose to be the lady of this house, the woman who would be my anchor, my port in the storm." He looked down at the box, then back up at me, his eyes dark and serious. "I never thought I would open this box. I never thought I would find that woman." He opened the lid. Nestled on a bed of faded white satin was a ring. It was stunning. A large rectangular sapphire, the color of a midnight sky, was flanked by intricate arrangements of brilliant cut diamonds on a platinum band. It was a piece of vintage elegance, an heirloom that radiated history and significance. It was not a ring one gave lightly. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't ask a question. He didn't get down on one knee. It wasn't a proposal in any traditional sense. It was a statement, a coronation. "This belongs to the lady of this house. It belongs to you." He took the ring from the box and gently took my left hand. My fingers trembled as he slid the cool, heavy ring onto my finger. It was a perfect fit. The sapphire glowed against my skin, a beacon of impossible blue. It felt less like a piece of jewelry and more like a mantle of responsibility, a symbol of my new role, my new life. It was a commitment more binding than any vow, a silent contract that sealed my place at his side, in the heart of his dangerous world. I looked from the ring to his face, and I saw my future reflected in his intense, possessive, and adoring gaze. I was no longer Alara Vance, the struggling nurse. I was his. The next morning, for the first time in a long time, I didn't wake up with a feeling of dread. I woke up with Dante's arm heavy and warm around my waist, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm against my back. We rose before the sun, a habit for both of us, but for entirely different reasons. Today, we would face the dawn together. We drove to the cemetery in his car, the powerful engine a low hum in the quiet morning. The world was still asleep, bathed in the soft gray light that comes just before sunrise. He parked outside the gates, and we walked the familiar path hand in hand, his large, warm hand completely enveloping mine. When we reached my mother's grave, the collection of his daily roses was still there, a small, beautiful shrine of velvet red petals. He was carrying a fresh one, its stem long and thorny. I was carrying a single white carnation, a nod to the simple, humble offerings I used to bring. He stepped forward first and gently placed the perfect red rose at the base of the headstone, a tribute to the woman who had shown his mother kindness. Then he stepped back, and I moved forward. I placed my simple white flower right beside his extravagant one, a tribute from a daughter who missed her mother. The two flowers, one symbolizing a debt of honor and passionate protection, the other symbolizing pure love and grief, lay together against the cold granite. Dante came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me back against his solid chest. I leaned my head back against his shoulder as we stood in silence, watching the eastern sky begin to bleed with color. Pinks and oranges painted the horizon, chasing away the last of the night's shadows. The first rays of sun broke over the distant hills, casting a warm, golden glow over the cemetery, making the dew on the grass sparkle like a million tiny jewels. I was no longer alone in my grief. I was no longer alone in my fear. The future that stretched before me was uncertain, undoubtedly filled with the peril and shadow of his world. But standing here, held securely in the arms of this dangerous, complicated man who had appointed himself my guardian, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had dragged me into his darkness, but he had also brought me into his light. The chill of the dawn no longer felt like a thief. It was just the beginning of a new day. For the first time since my mother died, I felt safe. I felt home.